Ready to uncover the harsh realities of being a medieval assassin? We're kicking off our discussion on that very topic tonight. The life of a medieval assassin was nothing like the romanticized tales that would later capture imaginations in stories and legends. Far from being a shadowy figure of mysterious allure, gliding effortlessly through moonlit corridors to dispatch targets with elegant precision, the reality of being a professional killer in medieval times was an existence filled with constant terror, grinding poverty, physical agony, and psychological torment that would break most ordinary people within mere weeks of attempting such a career. The first and most obvious problem facing anyone foolish enough to enter this profession was the simple fact that everyone wanted you dead. Not just your intended victims, mind you, but virtually every person in society had reason to fear and despise assassins. Kings and nobles lived in constant paranoia about potential killers lurking in every shadow, which meant that their guards, soldiers, and agents were always on the lookout for anyone who might pose a threat. The Church condemned assassination as one of the gravest sins imaginable, ensuring that even common peasants would view assassins as damned souls deserving of immediate execution. Merchants feared that political killings might disrupt trade and stability, while craftsmen and laborers worried that the chaos following an assassination might destroy their livelihoods and communities. This universal hatred meant that an assassin could never truly relax or feel safe anywhere in the known world. Every interaction with another human being carried the potential for discovery and immediate death. The simple act of buying bread from a baker, renting a room at an inn, or asking directions from a passerby could result in recognition, capture, and a horrifically painful execution if the assassin's identity became known. Sleep became a luxury that few assassins could afford for more than brief periods, as unconsciousness meant vulnerability to enemies who never rested in their desire for vengeance. The physical demands of the profession were absolutely brutal, in ways that would challenge even the strongest and most athletic individuals. Medieval castles and fortified buildings were specifically designed to prevent unauthorized entry, with walls that stretched impossibly high, moats filled with freezing water and deadly obstacles, drawbridges that remained raised and heavily guarded, and windows placed far beyond the reach of normal climbing abilities. An assassin attempting to infiltrate such a structure would need to possess the climbing skills of a mountain goat, the swimming ability of a fish, the endurance of a long-distance runner, and the flexibility of a contortionist, all while carrying weapons, tools, and supplies needed for their deadly mission. The tools and weapons available to medieval assassins were primitive and unreliable compared to what later centuries would develop. Swords were heavy, awkward to conceal, and required extensive training to use effectively without making noise that would alert guards. Daggers were easier to hide, but required getting extremely close to heavily protected targets, often necessitating hand-to-hand combat with multiple opponents who were better armed and armored. Crossbow bolts could be fired from a distance, but the weapons themselves were slow to reload, inaccurate beyond short ranges, and produced distinctive sounds that immediately revealed the assassin's location to every guard within hearing distance. Poison, the weapon most commonly associated with medieval assassination attempts, presented its own unique set of nightmarish challenges. Finding effective poisons required extensive knowledge of herbs, minerals, and organic compounds that was difficult to acquire without drawing suspicion from apothecaries, physicians, and other learned individuals who might report unusual inquiries to authorities. Many substances that were rumored to be deadly were actually quite unreliable, requiring precise dosages and specific preparation methods that were difficult to achieve under field conditions. Even when an assassin managed to obtain genuinely lethal poison, administering it to the intended victim often proved nearly impossible due to food tasters, careful meal preparation protocols, and the general paranoia of high-value targets who understood that poisoning was a constant threat. The social isolation experienced by medieval assassins was perhaps even more psychologically damaging than the physical dangers they faced. Normal human relationships became impossible when your profession required constant deception and the ability to kill, without hesitation or remorse. Forming friendships meant either lying constantly about your true nature or revealing your identity to people who would likely betray you for reward money or out of moral conviction. Romantic relationships were even more complicated, as few people would knowingly become involved with someone whose profession involved murder, while those who might be attracted to such danger were often criminals or mentally unstable individuals who presented their own risks and complications. Family relationships became strained or completely severed once relatives learned of an assassin's profession. Parents, siblings, and children faced the constant fear that their connection to a killer would result in their own imprisonment, torture, or execution. Many families of known assassins were subjected to surveillance, harassment, and persecution by authorities seeking information about the assassin's whereabouts or future plans. This pressure often forced families to publicly disown their assassin relatives, leaving the killers completely alone in the world without even the basic human comfort of family support and unconditional love. The financial aspects of assassination were far less lucrative than most people imagine. While it might seem logical that such dangerous and specialized work would command high prices, the reality was quite different. Most assassination contracts came from desperate individuals or groups who were already facing serious financial difficulties, meaning they often lacked the resources to pay substantial fees for murder services. Political assassinations were typically commissioned by rebels, conspirators, or ambitious nobles who were risking everything on their schemes and therefore had limited funds available for hiring killers. Even when an assassin managed to negotiate a substantial fee for their services, collecting payment often proved to be extremely difficult or impossible. Clients who hired assassins were not known for their trustworthiness or reliability, and many attempted to avoid payment by claiming the job was performed inadequately, the target was not the correct person, or the assassination caused unintended complications that voided their agreement. Some clients would simply disappear after the killing was completed, leaving the assassin without payment and with the additional problem of having committed murder for no financial benefit whatsoever. The legal consequences of being caught practicing assassination were among the most severe punishments available under medieval law. Unlike common criminals who might face imprisonment, fines, or relatively quick executions, captured assassins were typically subjected to prolonged torture, designed both to extract information about their employers and accomplices and to serve as public entertainment and deterrent for other potential killers. The methods of execution reserved for assassins were deliberately chosen to maximize suffering and create spectacular public displays that would be remembered and discussed for years afterward. Drawing and quartering was a favorite method for executing assassins, involving tying the condemned person to 4 horses that would then be driven in different directions, slowly tearing the victim apart while they remained conscious and screaming. Burning at the stake was another popular choice, particularly when church authorities were involved in the prosecution, as it provided symbolic purification of the assassin's corrupted soul, while creating a memorable spectacle that would discourage others from following the same path. Some particularly creative executioners developed specialized tortures specifically for assassins, including devices that would slowly crush bones, remove skin, or destroy internal organs while keeping the victim alive and aware for as long as possible. The constant stress of living under such extreme legal jeopardy had profound psychological effects on medieval assassins that modern people can barely imagine. Every moment of every day was shadowed by the knowledge that capture would result in unimaginable agony followed by death, while survival required maintaining perfect alertness and readiness to flee or fight at any instant. Sleep became fitful and brief, as unconsciousness meant vulnerability to capture. Eating became a challenge, as assassins needed to remain in peak physical condition, while often lacking access to regular meals or safe places to consume food without risk of discovery. The paranoia that developed among professional assassins often reached levels that would be considered severe mental illness by modern standards. Every stranger was a potential enemy, every friend a possible betrayer, every shadow a hiding place for pursuers, and every sound a signal that death was approaching. Many assassins developed elaborate rituals and superstitions designed to protect them from discovery, spending hours each day checking and rechecking their surroundings, weapons, and escape routes in obsessive patterns that provided psychological comfort but consumed enormous amounts of time and mental energy. Travel presented particularly acute challenges for medieval assassins, as movement between locations required passing through numerous checkpoints, staying at inns where other guests might recognize them, and navigating unfamiliar territories where local customs and dangers were unknown. Road conditions were often terrible, making rapid travel difficult or impossible, while bandits and wild animals presented additional threats that could be fatal even to skilled fighters. Weather was another enemy that could not be fought or bargained with, as assassins were often forced to continue traveling through storms, snow, or extreme heat that would kill unprepared individuals. The primitive medical knowledge of the medieval period meant that injuries sustained during assassination attempts, or while fleeing from pursuers, often led to infection, permanent disability, or death from complications that modern medicine could easily treat. A simple cut from a sword or dagger could become infected and kill an assassin weeks or months after the original injury, while broken bones often healed improperly, leaving killers with permanent limps, weakened grips, or other physical limitations that made their dangerous profession even more difficult and hazardous. Disease was a constant threat in medieval times, but assassins faced additional risks due to their lifestyle and working conditions. Spending nights hiding in sewers, swamps, or other unsanitary locations exposed them to plague, cholera, and other infectious diseases that spread rapidly in such environments. Poor nutrition weakened their immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness, while the stress of their profession made recovery more difficult even when medical treatment was available. Mental health problems were virtually inevitable for anyone who spent years killing other human beings for money. The psychological impact of repeatedly taking lives, often including innocent people who happened to be present during assassination attempts, created lasting trauma that medieval society had no understanding of how to treat. Many assassins developed what modern psychologists would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic depression, anxiety disorders, and other mental health conditions that made their already difficult lives even more unbearable. The moral and spiritual consequences of assassination weighed heavily on many killers, particularly those who had been raised in religious households or communities, where murder was considered one of the greatest sins possible. The Catholic Church taught that assassins would spend eternity in hell, suffering unimaginable torments as punishment for their crimes against God's commandments. Even assassins who did not personally believe in religious teachings often found themselves haunted by doubts about the afterlife and fears that their actions might indeed result in eternal damnation. Training to become an effective assassin required years of dangerous and painful preparation that many candidates did not survive. Learning to use weapons properly meant hours of practice each day, often resulting in cuts, bruises, and more serious injuries from training accidents. Developing the climbing, swimming, and acrobatic skills needed for infiltration required pushing the human body to its absolute limits, frequently causing permanent damage to joints, muscles, and bones. Studying poisons and other assassination techniques often involved experimenting with deadly substances that could easily kill the assassin during the learning process. The apprenticeship system used to train new assassins was particularly brutal, as experienced killers had little patience for mistakes that could compromise their own safety and freedom. Apprentice assassins were often used as expendable resources, sent on the most dangerous missions while their mentors remained safely hidden, and abandoned without hesitation if they were captured or wounded during operations. The survival rate among assassin apprentices was extremely low, with most dying during training or their first few missions. Finding employment as an assassin was surprisingly difficult, despite what might seem like constant demand for such services. Most people who wanted someone dead lacked the resources to hire professional killers, while those with sufficient wealth usually preferred to handle their conflicts through legal means, political maneuvering, or open warfare that did not require dealing with the criminal underworld. The clients who did seek assassination services were often desperate, mentally unstable, or themselves criminals, making them unreliable business partners who frequently created more problems than they solved. Competition among assassins was fierce and often deadly, as the limited number of available contracts meant that killers frequently found themselves competing against colleagues for the same jobs. This competition sometimes led to assassins murdering each other to eliminate rivals, creating a vicious cycle where professional killers spent as much time fighting other assassins as they did pursuing their intended victims. Some assassins attempted to resolve this problem by forming guilds or other cooperative organizations, but such groups invariably became targets for law enforcement and often collapsed when members betrayed each other for personal gain. The technical challenges of actually performing assassinations were far more complex than most people realize. Medieval buildings were designed with security in mind, featuring narrow windows, thick walls, multiple locks, and strategic layouts that made unauthorized entry extremely difficult. Guards were typically experienced soldiers who understood combat tactics and were specifically trained to watch for potential threats. Noble targets were often protected by multiple layers of security, including personal bodyguards, household guards, and broader military units that could respond quickly to any disturbance. Timing assassination attempts required precise knowledge of the target's schedule and habits, information that was difficult to obtain without extended surveillance that increased the risk of discovery. Many nobles deliberately varied their routines to make assassination attempts more difficult, while others employed decoys, used secret passages, or took other precautions that could confuse or trap potential killers. Even when an assassin managed to gather accurate intelligence about their target's movements, unexpected changes in schedule could result in mission failure and exposure to capture. The aftermath of a successful assassination often created more problems than it solved for the killer involved. Political murders typically resulted in massive manhunts involving hundreds or thousands of soldiers. guards, and investigators who would pursue the assassin with relentless determination. Rewards offered for information about the killer's identity or location could motivate ordinary citizens to become amateur detectives, creating additional layers of danger for the fugitive assassin. Some assassinations triggered broader conflicts, civil wars, or other political upheavals that made the entire region unsafe for anyone connected to the original killing. Failed assassination attempts were often worse than successful ones from the assassin's perspective, as they alerted targets to the threat while failing to eliminate the person who would now devote significant resources to hunting down their would-be killer. A failed assassin faced not only the original legal penalties for attempted murder, but also the personal vendetta of their intended victim, who would typically spare no expense in seeking revenge for the attempt on their life. The weapons and equipment needed for assassination work were expensive, difficult to obtain, and dangerous to possess. High-quality steel weapons cost more than most people earned in an entire year, while the specialized tools needed for infiltration, such as climbing equipment, lockpicks, and portable scaling devices, were often custom-made by skilled craftsmen who might report their unusual orders to authorities. Carrying such equipment was itself evidence of criminal intent, meaning that assassins faced the constant risk of arrest simply for possessing the tools of their trade. Maintaining weapons and equipment in proper working condition required considerable skill and resources that many assassins lacked. Swords needed regular sharpening, cleaning, and repair to remain effective, while leather armor and climbing gear deteriorated quickly under harsh use and needed frequent replacement. Poisons and other chemical agents had limited shelf lives and required careful storage to remain potent, adding another layer of complexity and expense to the assassin's already difficult existence. The seasonal nature of assassination work created additional financial pressures, as certain times of year were more favorable for such activities, while others made assassination attempts nearly impossible. Winter weather made travel extremely dangerous and infiltration of buildings more difficult, while summer brought longer days that reduced the cover of darkness that assassins typically relied upon. Religious holidays and festivals altered the normal routines of potential targets and increased security measures, making assassination attempts during these periods particularly risky. Retirement from the assassination profession was virtually impossible, as former assassins carried their reputations and the enmity of their victims' families and allies for the rest of their lives. Unlike other dangerous professions where workers could eventually settle into safer occupations, assassins found that their past would always follow them, making normal employment and peaceful lives essentially impossible to achieve. Many attempted to change their identities and relocate to distant regions, but medieval record-keeping and communication networks, while primitive by modern standards, were often sufficient to track down former killers years or decades after their last assassination. The psychological toll of constant vigilance and perpetual danger created lasting mental health problems that medieval society had no understanding of how to treat. Many assassins developed severe paranoia, chronic insomnia, violent outbursts, and other behavioral problems that made them dangerous to be around even when they were not actively pursuing targets. The isolation and stress of their profession often led to alcohol or drug abuse, creating additional health problems and further reducing their effectiveness as killers. Family life was essentially impossible for active assassins, as the dangers of their profession extended to anyone who associated with them. Spouses and children of known assassins became targets for revenge killings, while the constant threat of discovery and flight made it impossible to maintain stable households or provide consistent care for dependents. Many assassins who attempted to maintain families found that their loved ones became liabilities that enemies could exploit, forcing the killers to choose between abandoning their families or exposing them to mortal danger. The crude medical knowledge of the medieval period meant that assassins who were injured during their work often faced long, painful recoveries with permanent disabilities that ended their careers. A sword wound that became infected could result in amputation or death, while injuries to hands, eyes, or other body parts essential for assassination work could leave killers unable to perform their deadly profession. Without modern antibiotics, anesthesia, or surgical techniques, even minor injuries often had permanent consequences that forced assassins into early retirement or death. The legal system of medieval times offered no protection for assassins who found themselves in disputes with clients, competitors, or other criminals. Contracts for assassination services were obviously not enforceable through normal legal channels, leaving killers with no recourse when clients refused to pay, provided false information, or otherwise failed to honor their agreements. This lack of legal protection meant that assassins had to rely on violence or the threat of violence to resolve business disputes, further increasing the dangers of their already hazardous profession. Intelligence gathering required for successful assassinations often took weeks or months of careful observation and investigation that exposed assassins to discovery and capture. Learning about a target's habits, schedule, security arrangements, and vulnerabilities required extensive surveillance that increased the risk of recognition by guards, servants, or other individuals who might report suspicious behavior to authorities. Many assassination attempts failed because inadequate intelligence led to poor planning, while others were discovered during the information gathering phase before the actual attempt could be made. The primitive communication systems of medieval times made coordinating complex assassination plots extremely difficult and risky. Messages had to be carried by hand between conspirators, creating opportunities for interception, while face-to-face meetings increased the chances of discovery by law enforcement. Many assassination conspiracies were uncovered when messages were intercepted or when participants were captured and tortured into revealing information about their accomplices and plans. The social stigma attached to assassination work extended far beyond the immediate dangers of law enforcement and revenge, creating a complex web of social isolation that made normal human interaction virtually impossible. Even criminals and other outcasts from medieval society often viewed assassins with fear and distrust, understanding that anyone willing to kill for money might easily turn their deadly skills against former allies or business partners. This meant that assassins found themselves excluded not only from respectable society, but also from the criminal underworld that might have provided some measure of community and mutual support. Religious persecution added another layer of difficulty to the assassins' already miserable existence, as the Catholic Church actively hunted down killers for hire as part of their broader campaign against sin and moral corruption. Church investigators, backed by the full authority of religious law and often working closely with secular authorities, could offer spiritual salvation to anyone who provided information about assassins, creating powerful incentives for betrayal that went beyond simple monetary rewards. The promise of forgiveness for past sins motivated many people to actively seek out assassins and turn them over to authorities, making churches and religious communities particularly dangerous places for killers to hide or seek refuge. The physical deterioration that resulted from years of living under extreme stress and constant danger was readily apparent to anyone who encountered veteran assassins making it increasingly difficult for them to blend into normal society or maintain their cover identities. Chronic sleep deprivation created dark circles under the eyes and a haggard appearance that marked assassins as clearly as any identifying scar or tattoo. Malnutrition from irregular eating patterns and poor quality food resulted in weight loss, pale complexion, and other physical changes that made assassins stand out in crowds of healthy, well-fed citizens. The primitive hygiene standards of medieval times were particularly challenging for assassins, who often spent days or weeks hiding in filthy conditions without access to clean water, soap, or changes of clothing. The distinctive odor of someone who had been living in sewers, abandoned buildings, or wilderness hideouts was immediately recognizable to anyone with experience, making it difficult for assassins to approach targets or blend into crowds without drawing unwanted attention to themselves. Dental problems were endemic among medieval assassins due to poor nutrition, lack of dental care, and the stress-related teeth grinding that commonly developed among people living under constant threat. Missing, broken, or severely decayed teeth not only caused significant pain and made eating difficult, but also created distinctive speech patterns that could be used to identify particular assassins, even when they attempted to disguise their appearance or assume false identities. The constant need to remain alert and ready for combat created muscle tension and chronic pain that never fully resolved, as assassins could rarely afford to truly relax their guard long enough for their bodies to recover from the physical stress of their profession. This chronic pain affected their movement patterns, posture, and overall physical capabilities in ways that gradually reduced their effectiveness as killers while making them more recognizable to experienced observers who understood what to look for. Sleep deprivation was perhaps the most debilitating aspect of the assassin's lifestyle, as the need for constant vigilance made deep, restorative sleep almost impossible to achieve. Most assassins learned to sleep in brief periods of light dozing that allowed them to remain somewhat aware of their surroundings, but this fragmented sleep pattern never provided the mental and physical restoration that human beings require for optimal functioning. Over time, chronic sleep deprivation led to impaired judgment, slower reflexes, reduced coordination, and other problems that made assassination work even more dangerous than it already was. The mental effects of sleep deprivation compounded the psychological trauma of repeatedly killing other human beings, creating a downward spiral of deteriorating mental health that eventually rendered most assassins ineffective or completely unstable. Hallucinations, paranoid delusions, violent mood swings, and other symptoms of severe sleep deprivation were common among veteran assassins, making them unpredictable and dangerous even to their allies and employers. Nutrition was a constant challenge for assassins, who often lacked access to regular meals or safe places to consume food without risk of discovery. The need to remain mobile and ready to flee at any moment, and assassins typically carried only small amounts of portable food that would not spoil quickly, usually consisting of hard bread, dried meat, and other preserved items that provided basic calories, but lacked the variety of nutrients needed for optimal health. Vitamin deficiencies were common among assassins, leading to scurvy, night blindness, and other health problems that further reduced their effectiveness and made them more susceptible to injury and disease. The financial instability of assassination work made it impossible for most killers to maintain adequate nutrition even when they had access to food markets and merchants. The irregular income from assassination contracts, combined with the high costs of weapons, equipment, and bribes needed to avoid capture, left most assassins living in poverty that forced them to choose between essential supplies and adequate food. Many assassins supplemented their income through robbery, burglary, or other crimes that provided immediate cash, but increased their exposure to law enforcement and added additional legal charges to their already extensive criminal records. Weather presented challenges that modern people can barely imagine, as medieval assassins had to work in all conditions without the benefit of adequate clothing, shelter, or protective equipment. Rain could make climbing impossible and render many weapons ineffective, while snow and ice created treacherous conditions that increased the risk of falls, exposure, and frostbite. Extreme heat made heavy clothing and armor unbearable while increasing the risk of dehydration and heat exhaustion during long periods of surveillance or travel. Seasonal changes affected not only the physical conditions that assassins had to work in, but also the behavior patterns of their targets and the security measures protecting them. Winter months brought increased security around nobles who gathered in well-defended castles and fortified buildings, while summer travel seasons provided more opportunities for attacks, but also increased patrols and road security. Spring and autumn brought their own challenges, including unpredictable weather, muddy roads that slowed travel, and seasonal festivals that altered normal routines and security arrangements. The primitive transportation available in medieval times made escape after assassination attempts extremely difficult and dangerous. Horses, while faster than traveling on foot, required care, feeding, and veterinary attention that was expensive and time-consuming, while their distinctive appearance made them easy to track and identify. Most assassins could not afford quality horses and had to make do with inferior animals that might fail at crucial moments, while the theft of horses carried severe legal penalties that added another layer of risk to an already dangerous profession. Boats and ships provided alternative transportation for assassins working near coastlines or major rivers, but maritime travel presented its own unique dangers, including storms, pirates, and the constant risk of drowning for people who typically lacked swimming skills. Medieval ships were small, cramped, and uncomfortable, while passage fees were expensive and ship captains often cooperated with authorities to identify suspicious passengers who might be wanted criminals. The road systems of medieval Europe were primitive, poorly maintained, and extremely dangerous for travelers, particularly those who could not afford armed escorts or travel in large groups for mutual protection. Bandits regularly attacked lone travelers or small groups, while wild animals posed additional threats in forested areas. Bridge tolls, city entrance fees, and other travel-related expenses quickly consumed what little money assassins managed to earn from their deadly profession. Navigation was a significant challenge for medieval assassins, who often worked in unfamiliar territories without access to accurate maps or reliable directions. Getting lost could be fatal for someone fleeing after an assassination attempt, while arriving late for a carefully planned attack often meant that the opportunity would be lost forever. Many assassins developed extensive knowledge of particular regions, but this specialization limited their employment opportunities and made them more recognizable to local authorities who might be watching for known killers. Language barriers created additional difficulties for assassins who worked across cultural and linguistic boundaries, as the inability to communicate effectively could compromise missions and increase the risk of discovery. Medieval Europe contained dozens of different languages and dialects, while local customs and social expectations varied dramatically from region to region. An assassin who failed to understand local languages or customs would stand out immediately as a foreigner, drawing unwanted attention and suspicion. Cultural differences extended beyond language to include religious practices, social hierarchies, legal systems, and behavioral norms that assassins had to understand and navigate successfully to avoid detection. What was considered normal behavior in one region might be viewed as highly suspicious in another, while religious or cultural taboos could easily expose assassins who failed to observe local customs properly. The clothing and fashion of medieval times varied significantly between regions, social classes, and time periods, making it difficult for assassins to acquire appropriate disguises or blend into local populations. Fine clothing was expensive and difficult to obtain, while poor quality garments immediately marked the wearer as belonging to lower social classes that would not normally have access to high-value targets. The wrong style of clothing or inappropriate accessories could immediately reveal an assassin as an outsider who did not belong in their chosen location. Weapon laws and customs differ dramatically between different medieval jurisdictions, with some regions prohibiting the carrying of certain weapons while others required armed citizens to carry specific types of weapons for military service. An assassin who failed to understand local weapon laws might be arrested for carrying prohibited weapons or become suspicious by failing to carry weapons that local customs required. The distinctive regional styles of weapons and armor made it difficult for assassins to acquire appropriate equipment for each new location they worked in. Currency systems in medieval times were complex and varied significantly between regions, with different coins, exchange rates, and monetary systems that assassins had to understand to conduct business effectively. Carrying the wrong type of currency or failing to understand local exchange rates could mark an assassin as a foreigner or create suspicions about the source of their money. Counterfeit coins were common, and assassins who unknowingly used false currency could face additional criminal charges and unwanted attention from authorities. The guild systems that dominated medieval crafts and trades created another layer of complexity for assassins attempting to blend into local communities or acquire necessary supplies. Most craftsmen belonged to guilds that regulated their professions and could identify outsiders who lacked proper credentials or training. An assassin attempting to purchase weapons, tools, or other specialized equipment might be questioned about their guild membership, apprenticeship history, or professional qualifications in ways that could expose their true identity. Medical knowledge among medieval assassins was typically limited to basic first aid and the treatment of common injuries, but the demands of their profession often resulted in wounds and health problems that required more sophisticated medical attention. Seeking treatment from qualified physicians or surgeons carried significant risks, as medical professionals were often required to report suspicious injuries to authorities and might recognize wounds that were clearly caused by combat or violence. Self-treatment of injuries was dangerous and often ineffective, as assassins lacked access to proper medical supplies, sterile instruments, or effective medications. Infection was a constant threat that could turn minor cuts or wounds into life-threatening complications, while internal injuries or broken bones that were improperly treated could result in permanent disabilities that ended in an assassin's career or led to slow, painful death. The psychological impact of constant pain from untreated injuries added another layer of stress to an already difficult existence, as assassins often had to continue working despite significant physical limitations that would normally require extended rest and recovery. Pain medications were primitive and often more dangerous than the conditions they were supposed to treat, while alcohol, the most commonly available painkiller, created additional problems, including impaired judgment and physical coordination that could be fatal in combat situations. Torture was an accepted investigative technique throughout medieval Europe, meaning that captured assassins faced interrogation methods designed to extract information through the infliction of extreme physical pain. The knowledge that capture would inevitably result in prolonged torture created constant psychological pressure that affected every decision and action throughout an assassin's career. Many assassins carried poison or other means of suicide to avoid capture, but the decision of when to use such measures was complicated by the natural human desire to survive and the possibility that escape might still be possible. The torture techniques used against captured assassins were specifically designed to maximize pain while keeping the victim conscious and capable of speaking for extended periods. Devices such as the rack, thumb screws, and red-hot irons were commonly used to extract confessions and information about accomplices, employers, and future assassination plots. The physical damage from torture often left survivors with permanent disabilities, while the psychological trauma could result in lasting mental health problems that made normal life impossible. Public executions of captured assassins served both as entertainment for the general population and as deterrence for other potential killers, with authorities deliberately choosing execution methods that would create spectacular displays of suffering and death. The knowledge that failure would result in public humiliation and a horrifically painful death in front of jeering crowds added another layer of psychological pressure to an already stressful profession. The families of executed assassins often faced persecution, exile, or death as authorities sought to eliminate entire bloodlines that might seek revenge or carry on the family tradition of murder. This collective punishment created additional guilt and stress for assassins who understood that their chosen profession could result in the destruction of innocent family members who had no involvement in their criminal activities. Betrayal was perhaps the most common cause of capture among medieval assassins, as the high rewards offered for information about killers created powerful incentives for associates, employers, and even family members to cooperate with authorities. The knowledge that anyone could become a betrayer at any moment made trust impossible and forced assassins to view every human relationship as a potential threat to their survival. The rewards offered for information about assassins were often substantial enough to change the economic circumstances of entire families, making betrayal an attractive option for people facing poverty, debt, or other financial difficulties. Former friends, lovers, and business associates could become deadly enemies overnight when presented with the opportunity to claim reward, money in exchange for information about an assassin's identity or location. Competition between different law enforcement agencies, noble houses, and political factions sometimes resulted in bidding wars for information about particular assassins, driving reward amounts to levels that made betrayal irresistible for most people. The promise of wealth, protection, and social advancement motivated many individuals to actively seek out assassins for the purpose of turning them over to authorities. The corruption that permeated medieval justice systems created additional hazards for assassins, as legal officials could often be bribed to overlook crimes or provide false evidence. But these same officials might demand increasingly large payments over time or eventually betray their criminal associates when the risks became too great. Assassins who relied on corrupt officials for protection often found themselves trapped in relationships that became more dangerous and expensive over time, while the officials who accepted bribes became potential witnesses who could testify about the assassin's activities if they were ever arrested or decided to cooperate with higher authorities. Blackmail was a constant threat for assassins who had been identified by corrupt officials, criminals, or other individuals who possessed information about their identities or activities. but chose not to immediately report them to authorities. These blackmailers often demanded regular payments, sexual favors, or other considerations in exchange for their silence, creating ongoing financial and personal burdens that could last for years or decades. The knowledge that blackmailers might eventually demand too much or decide to collect official reward money instead of continuing their extortion schemes kept assassins in constant fear of exposure and betrayal. The primitive banking and financial systems of medieval times made it extremely difficult for assassins to safely store or transfer the money they earned from their deadly profession. Most wealth had to be carried in the form of heavy coins or valuable objects that were difficult to hide and transport safely, while the lack of reliable financial institutions meant that assassins could not establish accounts or conduct business transactions without exposing themselves to significant risks. Large amounts of cash or valuable items immediately raised questions about their source and could lead to investigations that exposed an assassin's criminal activities. Money changing and currency exchange presented particular challenges for assassins who worked across different regions or countries, as these transactions typically required documentation, references, or other forms of identification that could be traced back to the individual involved. Exchange rates were often manipulated by dishonest money changers who took advantage of travelers and criminals who could not seek legal recourse for fraudulent transactions, while the complex systems of weights, measures, and coin values made it easy for assassins to be cheated or shortchanged in their financial dealings. The feudal system that dominated medieval Europe created complex webs of loyalty, obligation, and authority that assassins had to understand and navigate carefully to avoid violating social expectations or legal requirements. Killing a nobleman could trigger feudal obligations that required his allies, vassals, and overlords to seek revenge, creating cascading effects that might involve hundreds or thousands of people in the pursuit of a single assassin. The interconnected nature of feudal relationships meant that even successful assassinations often had far-reaching consequences that continued to threaten the killer for years or decades after the original crime. Feudal justice systems were designed to protect the interests of nobles and other powerful individuals, meaning that crimes against important people received much more attention and resources than attacks on common citizens. An assassin who killed a peasant or merchant might face relatively little pursuit from authorities, while the murder of a noble could trigger massive manhunts involving entire armies and extensive networks of investigators, spies, and informants. This disparity in law enforcement response created strategic considerations that assassins had to account for when choosing targets and planning their escape routes. The concept of sanctuary in medieval times provided some theoretical protection for criminals who could reach designated holy places, but these sanctuaries were often violated by determined pursuers who were willing to risk religious condemnation to capture particularly dangerous or valuable criminals. Assassins who sought sanctuary often found themselves trapped in religious buildings where they could be easily monitored and eventually starved into surrender. While the protection offered by sanctuary laws was often temporary and subject to political negotiations that might result in the criminal being turned over to secular authorities. Religious authorities who controlled sanctuary locations were often corrupt or politically motivated, meaning that they might cooperate with secular law enforcement or accept bribes to violate the traditional protections offered by sanctuary. Some religious officials actively hunted criminals as part of their religious duties, viewing the capture of murderers and other serious criminals as a form of holy work that would earn them spiritual rewards and advancement within the church hierarchy. The limited medical knowledge of medieval times meant that many injuries or health conditions that would be minor inconveniences today could become career-ending disabilities or death sentences for medieval assassins. Eye injuries that affected vision, hand injuries that reduced grip strength or dexterity, leg injuries that impaired mobility, and hearing loss from combat or explosions could render an assassin incapable of performing the precise, demanding work that their profession required. Without access to modern medical treatments, surgical procedures, or rehabilitation techniques, even relatively minor injuries often had permanent consequences that forced assassins into early retirement or death. Infectious diseases were particularly dangerous for assassins, who often lived in unsanitary conditions, worked in areas with poor hygiene, and lacked access to clean water and adequate nutrition. Plague, cholera, typhus, and other epidemic diseases spread rapidly in medieval cities and could kill even healthy adults within days or weeks of infection. Assassins who contracted serious illnesses often died without medical treatment, while those who survived might suffer permanent health effects that reduced their effectiveness as killers and made them more vulnerable to capture or death in future confrontations. Mental illness, while not understood in medieval times, was clearly recognized as a problem that affected many people who engaged in violence as a profession. Assassins who showed signs of madness, whether from the psychological trauma of repeatedly killing other people or from other causes, often became unreliable and dangerous to their employers and associates. Mad assassins might attack the wrong targets, fail to follow instructions properly, or become violent toward their allies, creating additional risks and complications for everyone involved in assassination plots. The social isolation experienced by most assassins often led to depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems that modern psychology recognizes as serious conditions requiring professional treatment. Medieval society had no understanding of these conditions and no effective treatments for them, meaning that assassins suffering from mental illness had to cope with their problems alone while continuing to perform demanding and dangerous work that required clear thinking and emotional stability. Alcoholism and drug abuse were common among medieval assassins who used these substances to cope with the stress, pain, and psychological trauma of their profession. While alcohol and certain herbal preparations could provide temporary relief from physical and emotional pain, they also impaired judgment, reduced coordination, and created dependencies that interfered with the assassin's ability to perform their work effectively. Many assassins found themselves trapped in cycles of substance abuse that gradually destroyed their health and effectiveness while creating additional financial burdens and legal risks. The primitive understanding of nutrition in medieval times meant that most assassins suffered from dietary deficiencies that affected their physical and mental performance. Vitamin C deficiency caused scurvy. Vitamin D deficiency led to bone problems. Iron deficiency resulted in anemia, and protein deficiency caused muscle wasting and weakness. These nutritional problems were often compounded by irregular eating patterns, poor quality food, and the stress of constant danger that affected digestion and nutrient absorption. Food safety was a constant concern for assassins who often had to eat whatever was available without the luxury of choosing fresh, properly prepared meals. Spoiled meat, contaminated water, and improperly stored grains could cause food poisoning that left assassins incapacitated at crucial moments when they needed to be at peak performance. The lack of refrigeration and proper food storage techniques meant that even experienced assassins regularly risked serious illness from contaminated food. Seasonal food shortages affected everyone in medieval society. But assassins were particularly vulnerable because they often lacked the social connections and resources needed to secure adequate food during times of scarcity. Failed harvests, severe weather, and political disruptions could create famines that lasted for months or years, forcing assassins to compete with desperate populations for increasingly scarce food supplies. Many assassins died of starvation during extended famines, while others were forced to take extreme risks to obtain food that often led to their capture or death. The clothing and equipment needed for assassination work was expensive, difficult to obtain, and dangerous to possess, creating constant financial pressures and legal risks for professional killers. High-quality weapons, armor, climbing equipment, and other specialized tools could cost more than most people earned in several years, while the possession of such items without legitimate explanation could lead to arrest and prosecution, even when no specific crimes had been committed. Maintaining and replacing equipment was an ongoing expense that consumed much of the income that assassins managed to earn from their deadly profession. Weapons needed regular sharpening, cleaning, and repair to remain effective, while leather armor and other equipment deteriorated quickly under harsh use and needed frequent replacement. The specialized nature of assassination equipment meant that it often had to be custom-made by skilled craftsmen who charged premium prices and might report unusual orders to authorities. The seasonal nature of many assassination opportunities created feast or famine income patterns that made financial planning extremely difficult for medieval assassins. Political conflicts, religious festivals, harvest seasons, and weather patterns all affected the demand for assassination services and the feasibility of carrying out murder contracts. Assassins might earn substantial sums during busy periods, but then face months of unemployment when assassination opportunities are scarce or too dangerous to pursue. Competition from other assassins, mercenaries, and criminals meant that professional killers often had to underbid each other for available contracts, driving down prices and reducing the financial rewards of an already dangerous profession. Some assassination contracts were awarded to the lowest bidder rather than the most skilled or experienced killer, creating a race to the bottom that forced many assassins to work for inadequate compensation that barely covered their expenses and equipment costs. The irregular nature of assassination work made it impossible for killers to establish steady income streams or build the financial reserves needed to weather periods of unemployment or reduced demand for their services. Unlike craftsmen or merchants who could develop ongoing relationships with regular customers, assassins typically worked on a contract basis with clients who might never require their services again, making business planning and financial security virtually impossible to achieve. Retirement from the assassination profession was extremely difficult because former assassins continued to face threats from the families and allies of their past victims, while their criminal records and reputations made it nearly impossible to find legitimate employment or integrate into normal society. Many attempted assassins who tried to retire found themselves drawn back into criminal activities by financial necessity or by former associates who threatened to expose their past activities if they refused to participate in new crimes. The lack of any social safety net in medieval times meant that injured, sick, or aging assassins had no source of support other than their own resources and whatever help they could obtain from criminal associates who might themselves be unreliable or dangerous. Assassins who became incapacitated through injury or illness often faced starvation or death unless they had managed to accumulate sufficient resources during their active careers, which was rare given the financial instability of their profession. Family relationships were complicated by the moral and legal implications of assassination work, as relatives often faced difficult choices between loyalty to their assassin family members and their own safety and moral beliefs. Many families of assassins were subjected to surveillance, harassment, and persecution by authorities seeking information about the killer's activities, while the constant threat of revenge attacks made normal family life impossible to maintain. Children of assassins faced particular challenges as they grew up knowing that their parents' profession made them targets for revenge and social outcasts who would struggle to find acceptance in normal society. Many assassins' children were forced to assume false identities or were sent away to distant relatives to protect them from the consequences of their parents' criminal activities, creating family separations that often lasted for years or decades. Marriage and romantic relationships were extremely difficult for assassins to maintain, as few people would knowingly become involved with someone whose profession involved murder, while those who might be attracted to such danger were often criminals or mentally unstable, individuals who presented their own risks and complications. The need to maintain false identities and conceal their true profession made honest relationships virtually impossible for most assassins. The constant stress of living under false identities and maintaining elaborate deceptions took a severe psychological toll on many assassins, who had to remember complex lies about their backgrounds, occupations, and personal histories, while being constantly alert for questions or situations that might expose their true identities. This psychological burden often led to paranoia, anxiety, and other mental health problems that further complicated their already difficult lives. The training and apprenticeship systems that existed for aspiring assassins were brutal, exploitative arrangements that killed or permanently disabled more candidates than they successfully trained, creating a profession with extraordinarily high casualty rates even before individuals began taking on actual assassination contracts. Most training programs were run by experienced killers who had little interest in the welfare of their apprentices and viewed them primarily as expendable resources who could be used for dangerous tasks while providing unpaid labor and sharing any income they managed to generate through criminal activities. Apprentice assassins were typically required to perform the most dangerous and degrading tasks associated with assassination work, including reconnaissance missions in heavily guarded areas, disposal of bodies and evidence from their mentors' killings, and serving as decoys or distractions during actual assassination attempts. These activities exposed apprentices to enormous risks while providing minimal training in the skills they would actually need to become effective killers, creating a system that was more focused on exploitation than education. The physical training required to develop the strength, agility, and combat skills needed for assassination work was extremely demanding and often resulted in permanent injuries that ended apprentices' careers before they had even begun their professional activities. Training exercises included climbing practice on dangerous surfaces, combat training with real weapons that frequently caused serious wounds, and endurance testing that pushed human physical capabilities beyond safe limits. Many apprentices died during training accidents, while others suffered injuries that left them unable to perform the physical demands of assassination work. Weapons training was particularly hazardous because apprentices were expected to practice with sharp, deadly weapons under conditions that closely simulated real combat situations. Training with swords, daggers, crossbows, and other assassination weapons resulted in frequent accidents that could cause severe cuts, puncture wounds, broken bones, and other injuries that might become infected and lead to death in an era before modern medical treatment. Master assassins showed little sympathy for injured apprentices and often abandoned those who became too badly hurt to continue their training. The psychological conditioning required to transform ordinary people into killers involved exposure to violence, death, and moral corruption that permanently damaged the mental health of most individuals who underwent such training. Apprentices were often required to witness executions, torture sessions, and other forms of extreme violence as part of their education, while being gradually desensitized to human suffering through increasingly direct participation in acts of cruelty and murder. Many apprentice assassins were forced to commit their first murders as part of their training, often killing innocent people who posed no threat to anyone, but were selected as practice targets to test the apprentices' willingness to take human life. These training murders created additional legal liability for apprentices, while inflicting psychological trauma that often led to mental health problems, including nightmares, depression, paranoia, and violent outbursts that made normal social relationships impossible. The selection process for apprentice assassins often targeted vulnerable individuals, including orphans, runaway children, criminals fleeing justice, and desperate people facing poverty or other extreme circumstances who had few alternatives available to them. These vulnerable candidates were often deceived about the true nature of assassination work and found themselves trapped in training programs that they could not safely leave once they had begun learning deadly secrets and techniques. Escape from apprenticeship programs was extremely dangerous because apprentices possessed knowledge about their mentors, identities, methods, and criminal activities that made them security risks who might be killed to prevent them from sharing information with authorities or competitors. Many apprentices who attempted to leave their training were murdered by their mentors or other members of assassination organizations who viewed them as potential threats to operational security. The financial exploitation of apprentices was another major problem in assassination training programs, as apprentices were typically required to turn over any money they earned through criminal activities while receiving minimal support for their basic needs, including food, shelter, and medical care. This exploitative arrangement left apprentices completely dependent on their mentors while providing no financial security or prospects for future independence. The social isolation imposed on apprentice assassins was severe and deliberate, designed to break down their connections to normal society and make them completely dependent on their criminal mentors and associates. Apprentices were typically forbidden from maintaining relationships with family members, friends, or other connections to legitimate society, while being encouraged to view normal people as potential enemies or victims rather than fellow human beings deserving of compassion and respect. The graduation from apprentice to full assassin status was often marked by particularly challenging or dangerous assignments that served as final tests of the candidate's skills, loyalty, and willingness to commit murder. These graduation assignments typically involved killing difficult targets under dangerous circumstances, with failure often resulting in the apprentice's death, either from the mission itself or from punishment by their mentors for inadequate performance. Success in completing apprenticeship training did not guarantee employment or income as a professional assassin, as the market for assassination services was limited and highly competitive. Many newly trained assassins found themselves competing with more experienced killers for scarce contracts, while lacking the reputation, connections, and resources needed to attract high-paying clients or secure the best assassination opportunities. The transition from apprentice to independent assassin was particularly challenging because new professionals had to establish their own networks of contacts, suppliers, and information sources while building reputations that would attract potential clients. This transition period was extremely dangerous because inexperienced assassins often made mistakes that led to their capture or death, while their lack of established relationships left them vulnerable to betrayal and exploitation by more experienced criminals. Professional development and skill improvement for active assassins was an ongoing challenge that required constant practice, training, and adaptation to new techniques and technologies. The demands of staying current with advances in weapons, security measures, and law enforcement techniques created additional time and financial pressures for assassins who were already struggling to earn adequate income and avoid capture. Specialization within the assassination profession created both opportunities and limitations for individual killers, as developing expertise in particular types of assassination work could lead to higher paying contracts, but also reduce the range of available employment opportunities. Assassins who specialized in particular weapons, target types, or operational methods often found themselves unable to adapt when changes in technology, politics, or security measures made their specializations less valuable or relevant. Geographic specialization was another factor that affected assassin careers, as developing detailed knowledge of particular regions, cities, or types of locations could make killers more effective in those areas, but less capable of working successfully in unfamiliar territories. Assassins who became too closely associated with particular geographic regions also became more vulnerable to capture by local authorities who learned to recognize their methods and behavioral patterns. The development of signature methods or distinctive techniques could help assassins build reputations that attracted high-paying clients, but these same signatures could also make them easier for law enforcement to identify and track. Many experienced assassins struggled with the balance between developing effective techniques that could be refined and perfected over time and maintaining enough variation in their methods to avoid creating patterns that could be used to identify them. Innovation and creativity in assassination techniques were essential for staying ahead of evolving security measures and law enforcement techniques. But experimentation with new methods was extremely risky and often resulted in mission failures or capture when untested techniques proved inadequate under real operational conditions. The conservative nature of most assassination work meant that proven techniques were usually preferred over innovative approaches, limiting opportunities for professional growth and development. Continuing education and skill development for assassins typically involved learning from other criminals, studying the methods of successful killers, and adapting techniques from military combat, hunting, and other related activities. However, accessing this education often required exposing oneself to additional criminals who might become competitors, informants, or security threats. While the informal nature of criminal education made it difficult to verify the accuracy or effectiveness of new techniques, the physical demands of assassination work increased with age as assassins found their strength, agility, reflexes, and endurance declining over time, while the requirements of their profession remained as demanding as ever. Older assassins often found themselves unable to perform the climbing, running, fighting, and other physical activities that had been routine during their younger years, forcing them to either retire from the profession or accept less physically demanding but often lower-paying contracts. Age-related health problems were particularly challenging for assassins who lacked access to adequate medical care and had often suffered injuries and physical damage during their careers that created ongoing health issues. Arthritis, vision problems, hearing loss, and other age-related conditions could severely impact an assassin's effectiveness while creating additional, vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies or competitors. The accumulation of enemies and grudges over the course of an assassination career created increasing security threats as killers aged and potentially became less capable of defending themselves against revenge attacks. Long-term survival as an assassin required not only avoiding capture by authorities, but also managing the growing number of personal enemies who might seek revenge for past assassinations or other criminal activities. Reputation management became increasingly important as assassins developed longer track records that could either enhance their professional prospects or create additional risks depending on how their past activities were perceived by potential clients and enemies. A reputation for effectiveness and reliability could lead to better contracts and higher fees, while a reputation for failure, betrayal, or excessive brutality could make it difficult to find employment, or could attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. The social stigma attached to assassination work extended to anyone who associated with known killers, creating isolation that deepened over time as assassins found it increasingly difficult to maintain relationships with people who were not themselves involved in criminal activities. This progressive social isolation often led to depression, paranoia, and other mental health problems that further reduced assassins' effectiveness and quality of life. Legacy and inheritance issues were particularly complex for assassins who had accumulated wealth or property during their careers, but needed to transfer these assets to heirs without exposing them to legal liability or revenge attacks from the assassin's enemies. Many assassins found it impossible to provide for their families or leave meaningful inheritance because their criminal activities tainted any wealth they had acquired and made it dangerous for their heirs to claim or use such inheritance. The ultimate futility of the assassination profession became apparent to most practitioners as they realized that their work rarely achieved any lasting positive outcomes, while creating enormous personal costs and risks that far outweighed any benefits they might have gained. Political assassinations seldom produced the changes their clients desired, while personal revenge killings typically escalated conflicts rather than resolving them, leaving assassins with the realization that they had wasted their lives on meaningless violence that accomplished nothing of value. The knowledge that their profession contributed nothing positive to society and often made existing problems worse created existential crises for many assassins who began to question the meaning and purpose of their lives while feeling trapped in careers that offered no honorable exit strategies. This philosophical despair, combined with the practical hardships of assassination work, often led to self-destructive behaviors, including suicide, reckless risk-taking, and deliberate exposure to capture or death as forms of escape from lives that had become unbearable. The spiritual consequences of a lifetime spent in murder weighed heavily on the minds of medieval assassins, particularly as they aged and began to contemplate their own mortality and the afterlife that awaited them. The Catholic Church's teachings about hell and eternal damnation were not merely abstract theological concepts for people living in medieval times, but vivid, terrifying realities that shaped every aspect of daily life and decision-making. For assassins who had violated the most fundamental commandment against taking human life, often repeatedly and without genuine repentance, the prospect of facing divine judgment created constant psychological torment that added another layer of suffering to their already miserable existence. The concept of purgatory, while offering some hope for eventual salvation, required genuine repentance and the performance of adequate penance to cleanse the soul of mortal sin. For assassins whose entire careers were built upon the systematic violation of God's laws, The amount of penance required for salvation seemed impossibly vast, while the sincerity of any repentance was questionable given that most continued practicing their deadly profession out of necessity rather than choosing to abandon it for legitimate occupations. Many assassins found themselves trapped in cycles of sin and attempted repentance that never seemed adequate to address the magnitude of their crimes against divine law. The inability to receive proper religious sacraments created additional spiritual anxiety for assassins who understood that salvation might depend on dying in a state of grace after receiving last rites and final confession. However, seeking out priests for confession meant exposing their crimes to religious authorities, who might have obligations to report serious sins to secular law enforcement. While dying suddenly during assassination, attempts or capture meant facing divine judgment without the spiritual preparation that medieval Christians considered essential for salvation. Dreams and nightmares plagued many assassins with visions of hell, demons, and the tormented souls of their victims who appeared to demand justice or revenge from beyond the grave. These supernatural experiences, whether interpreted as genuine spiritual phenomena or psychological manifestations of guilt and fear, created constant reminders of the spiritual consequences of their actions, while making peaceful sleep virtually impossible to achieve. Many assassins reported being visited by the ghosts of their victims, who would reproach them for their crimes and threaten them with divine retribution that awaited them after death. The social aspects of religious observance became problematic for assassins, who needed to maintain cover identities that included regular church attendance and participation in religious ceremonies, while knowing that they were committing sacrilege by pretending to be devout Christians while continuing to practice murder as a profession. The hypocrisy required to maintain religious cover identities created additional psychological stress and spiritual anguish for killers who understood that they were compounding their sins by deceiving religious communities and mocking the sacred rituals they pretended to observe. Religious festivals and holy days became particularly difficult periods for assassins who were forced to participate in celebrations of divine mercy, forgiveness, and salvation, while knowing that they were among the most damned souls in existence, according to church teachings. Christmas, Easter, and other major religious holidays emphasized themes of redemption and spiritual renewal that seemed impossibly distant for people whose lives were dedicated to activities that the church considered absolutely evil and unforgivable under normal circumstances. The medieval understanding of divine justice included the belief that God's punishment for sin could manifest in earthly life as well as in the afterlife, leading many assassins to interpret their suffering, failures, and misfortunes as evidence of divine displeasure and supernatural punishment for their crimes. Every injury, illness, setback, or stroke of bad luck could be seen as a manifestation of God's wrath, creating a paranoid worldview in which assassins viewed themselves as being actively persecuted by supernatural forces that were gradually destroying them in preparation for eternal damnation. Superstitions and folk beliefs about curses, evil eyes, and supernatural retribution for murder were widespread in medieval society and created additional psychological burdens for assassins who feared that their victims or their victims' families might have placed curses upon them that would bring misfortune, illness, or death. These superstitious fears often led assassins to engage in elaborate protective rituals, carry protective amulets, or seek out cunning folk and witches who claimed to be able to remove curses or provide supernatural protection from the consequences of their crimes. The primitive understanding of mental illness in medieval times meant that the psychological symptoms experienced by many assassins were often interpreted as evidence of demonic possession, divine punishment, or supernatural curse rather than as treatable medical conditions. Assassins who suffered from what modern psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, or anxiety disorders were often viewed as being literally haunted by evil spirits or cursed by their victims, leading to social isolation and persecution that compounded their existing psychological problems. Attempts to seek spiritual counsel or confession from sympathetic religious figures often backfired when priests, monks, or other clergy members became horrified by the extent of an assassin's crimes and either refused to provide absolution or demanded impossible penances that could not be completed without abandoning the profession entirely. Some religious authorities attempted to help assassins find paths to redemption, but these efforts usually required complete confession of all past crimes and full cooperation with secular authorities in prosecuting other criminals, conditions that most assassins could not accept without facing certain execution. The medieval church's emphasis on pilgrimage as a form of penance created some opportunities for assassins to attempt spiritual redemption through arduous journeys to holy sites. But these pilgrimages were extremely dangerous for wanted criminals, who would be traveling through multiple jurisdictions while being vulnerable to recognition and capture. Many assassins who attempted redemptive pilgrimages were captured and executed before reaching their destinations, while others found that even completing difficult pilgrimages did not provide the spiritual peace and forgiveness they had hoped to achieve. Charitable works and acts of mercy were traditionally considered important forms of penance that could help offset the spiritual consequences of sin. But assassins found it extremely difficult to engage in meaningful charitable activities without exposing themselves to recognition and capture. Donating money to churches or charitable causes required having funds available and being able to conduct transactions without aroused suspicion, while personal service to the poor or sick required time and presence in communities where assassins might be identified by people who knew their true identities. The concept of martyrdom and redemptive suffering offered some theoretical hope for assassins who might achieve salvation through accepting suffering and death as punishment for their crimes. But the church taught that true martyrdom required dying for righteous causes rather than simply suffering the consequences of evil actions. Assassins who were captured and executed by authorities were generally not considered martyrs, but rather criminals, receiving just punishment for their crimes, making their suffering meaningless from a spiritual perspective. Attempts to reform and abandon the assassination profession were often unsuccessful because former assassins continued to face threats from past enemies while lacking the skills, resources, and social connections needed to establish legitimate occupations. Many who tried to leave the profession found themselves drawn back into criminal activities by financial necessity, blackmail, or threats from former associates, creating cycles of attempted reform and renewed criminality that made genuine repentance seem impossible to achieve. The influence of assassination work on family members created additional spiritual burdens for killers who understood that their profession endangered not only their own souls, but also the spiritual welfare of their loved ones, who might be corrupted by association with evil or driven to sin through the hardships created by their relatives' criminal activities. Children of assassins often grew up in environments of violence, deception, and moral corruption that made it difficult for them to develop normal ethical values and spiritual understanding. Marriage and family relationships were complicated by the spiritual implications of living with someone whose profession involved systematic violation of divine law, as spouses of assassins often struggled with questions about their own moral culpability for supporting or benefiting from murder. Some religious authorities taught that family members of assassins shared in their guilt if they knowingly accepted financial support or other benefits derived from assassination activities, creating impossible moral dilemmas for people who depended on assassin family members for their survival. The education and moral development of children raised in assassin families was particularly challenging because parents needed to prepare their offspring for lives in normal society while concealing the true source of the family's income and the moral reality of the parents' profession. Many assassin parents found it impossible to provide proper moral guidance to their children while continuing to practice murder, creating generational cycles of moral confusion and criminal behavior that extended the spiritual consequences of assassination work far beyond the original killers. Community relationships and social integration were permanently damaged for families associated with known or suspected assassins, as religious communities often shunned people who were connected to murderers regardless of their personal innocence or ignorance of their relatives' activities. This social ostracism often extended to multiple generations, creating lasting consequences that affected children and grandchildren of assassins who had no involvement in or knowledge of their ancestors' criminal activities. The theological questions raised by assassination work included complex issues about free will, divine forgiveness, predestination, and the possibility of redemption for people who had committed what the Church considered among the most serious possible sins. Medieval theologians generally taught that no sin was completely unforgivable if the sinner genuinely repented and performed adequate penance, but they also emphasized that certain sins, including murder, required extraordinary measures for redemption that few people would be capable of completing successfully. The practical impossibility of making adequate restitution for murder created additional theological problems for assassins who understood that genuine repentance traditionally required not only feeling sorry for past sins, but also making amends to the victims and their families. Since murdered victims could not be restored to life, and their families were more likely to seek revenge than to accept apologies or compensation, assassins found themselves unable to complete the restitution that proper repentance seemed to require according to church teachings. The cyclical nature of violence in medieval society meant that assassination activities often triggered blood feuds, revenge killings, and ongoing conflicts that continued long after the original assassins had died, creating spiritual consequences that extended across multiple generations and affected entire families and communities. Assassins who understood these broader consequences of their actions often experienced additional guilt and spiritual anguish about the long-term suffering they had unleashed through their criminal activities, while feeling powerless to stop the cycles of violence they had initiated. The ultimate futility and meaninglessness of assassination work from a spiritual perspective became clear to many practitioners who realized that their activities had achieved no positive outcomes while creating enormous amounts of suffering, sin, and spiritual damage that would require generations to heal. This recognition of the essential meaninglessness of their life's work often led to profound despair and existential crisis among older assassins, who had devoted their entire adult lives to activities that had accomplished nothing of lasting value while damning their souls and destroying their relationships with God, family, and community. The final realization that haunted most medieval assassins in their declining years was the crushing understanding that their entire careers had been built upon an elaborate self-deception about the nature and value of their work. What had perhaps begun as a desperate attempt to escape poverty, gain power, or achieve some form of twisted honor had revealed itself over time to be nothing more than a prolonged suicide that destroyed everything meaningful about human existence while contributing nothing positive to the world around them. The legendary figures that inspired many to enter the profession were revealed to be either complete fabrications or individuals whose lives had been far more miserable and meaningless than the romantic stories suggested. The reality of assassination work bore no resemblance to the tales of shadowy heroes who struck down tyrants and protected the innocent, but instead consisted of petty murders motivated by greed, revenge, and political ambition that served only to increase suffering and chaos in an already violent and unstable world. The clients who hired assassins were invariably revealed to be individuals whose moral character was even worse than that of the killers they employed, as honest people with legitimate grievances typically sought justice through legal means, or accepted their losses rather than resorting to murder. The fact that assassins spent their careers serving the worst elements of society, enabling the most corrupt and evil people to eliminate their enemies and consolidate their power, added another layer of moral corruption to an already damnable profession. The skills and knowledge that assassins developed during their careers were completely useless for any legitimate purpose and could not be applied to honest occupations that might provide meaning, satisfaction, or social value. Unlike soldiers who might apply their combat skills to protecting their communities, or craftsmen who created useful objects that enriched people's lives, assassins developed expertise that could only be used to cause suffering and death, making their professional knowledge a burden rather than an asset when they attempted to reform their lives. The physical deterioration caused by years of stress, poor living conditions, injuries, and psychological trauma left most veteran assassins as broken, prematurely aged individuals who looked decades older than their actual years and suffered from chronic pain, disability, and health problems that would plague them for whatever remained of their lives. The few assassins who managed to survive long enough to reach old age typically did so as crippled, diseased, mentally ill individuals who served as warnings to younger criminals about the ultimate consequences of choosing violence as a profession. The social legacy of assassination work was entirely negative, as former assassins found themselves remembered only for their crimes and failures, while any positive qualities they might have possessed were forgotten or overshadowed by their reputation as killers. Unlike other professions where skilled practitioners might be remembered with respect or admiration, assassins were universally reviled, and their names became synonymous with evil, treachery, and moral corruption that parents would use to frighten children into good behavior. The economic impact of spending a lifetime in assassination work was overwhelmingly negative for most practitioners, who typically ended their careers poorer than they had been when they started, despite having earned substantial sums during periods of high activity. The costs of maintaining weapons and equipment, bribing officials, paying informants, and supporting themselves while hiding from law enforcement consumed most of their income, while the irregular nature of assassination contracts made financial planning impossible and prevented them from building any lasting wealth or security. The families of assassins invariably suffered more than they benefited from their relatives' criminal career, as the dangers, social stigma, and moral corruption associated with assassination work destroyed family relationships and often led to persecution, exile, or death for innocent family members. Children of assassins often grew up in poverty despite their parents' criminal earnings, while living under constant threat of revenge attacks and social ostracism that limited their opportunities for education, marriage, and legitimate employment. The broader social consequences of assassination activities were universally negative, as political murders typically led to increased instability, violence, and oppression, rather than the positive changes that clients claimed to desire. The removal of corrupt officials through assassination usually resulted in their replacement by even more corrupt individuals who had learned from their predecessors' fate and took additional precautions to protect themselves while oppressing their subjects more harshly. The psychological toll of realizing that one's entire adult life had been wasted on meaningless evil created a form of despair that was beyond the understanding of people who had lived normal lives with legitimate occupations and meaningful relationships. This existential horror, combined with the physical deterioration and social isolation that characterized the end stage of most assassination careers, often drove veteran killers to suicide, madness, or desperate attempts at redemption that typically ended in capture and execution. The legacy of fear and hatred that assassins left behind ensured that their names would be cursed for generations after their deaths, while their victims would be remembered with sympathy and their families would continue seeking revenge long after the original killers had died. This perpetuation of hatred and violence meant that assassination work created lasting damage to society that continued causing suffering long after the assassins themselves had paid the ultimate price for their crimes. The medical consequences of assassination work included not only the obvious risks of violent death during missions, but also the cumulative health effects of chronic stress, malnutrition, exposure to harsh conditions, and the psychological trauma of repeatedly killing other human beings. Most assassins who avoided execution died relatively young from stress-related illnesses, infections from untreated wounds, or the effects of substance abuse used to cope with their psychological problems. The spiritual consequences of assassination work, according to medieval Christian belief, included not only eternal damnation for the killers themselves, but also spiritual contamination that affected their families and communities for multiple generations. The Church taught that the souls of murder victims who died without proper spiritual preparation might be trapped in purgatory or hell, while their killers faced the most severe punishments that divine justice could inflict, creating cycles of supernatural suffering that extended far beyond earthly life. The ultimate judgment on the profession of assassination, from every possible perspective including practical effectiveness, moral value, social contribution, personal fulfillment, and spiritual consequence, was overwhelmingly negative and demonstrated that choosing to become a medieval assassin was perhaps the worst possible decision that any human being could make. The combination of extreme danger, constant suffering, moral corruption, social isolation, spiritual damnation, and ultimate futility made assassination work a form of prolonged suicide that destroyed everything worthwhile about human existence while accomplishing nothing positive or meaningful. The few historical records of individual assassins who managed to survive their careers and leave accounts of their experiences universally described lives of unrelenting misery, regret, and despair that served as warnings to anyone who might consider following similar paths. These testimonies revealed that even the most successful assassins, those who had achieved wealth, reputation, and survival beyond the normal life expectancy of their profession, ultimately viewed their careers as catastrophic mistakes that had wasted their lives and destroyed their souls while contributing nothing of value to the world around them. Thus, the medieval profession of assassination stands as perhaps the clearest possible example of how the pursuit of power, wealth, and revenge through violence leads inevitably to self-destruction and meaninglessness, creating suffering that extends far beyond the immediate participants while accomplishing nothing that could justify the enormous human costs involved. The reality of being a medieval assassin was so thoroughly awful, from every conceivable perspective, that it serves as a perfect cautionary tale about the ultimate consequences of choosing evil over good, violence over peace, and selfishness over service to the common welfare of humanity.